A large diaphragm condenser is generally the microphone of choice for capturing vocals in the studio. Condensers, in general, enjoy a reputation for having a more detailed, open sound than dynamic mics. Now, there are many very fine studio dynamics, but for recording they're most often found on instruments. When it comes to vocals, they tend to be used more for broadcast applications than studio recordings. Another good mic type for vocals, although probably not as widely employed for that in modern times as they were in the past, is the ribbon mic. Ribbon mics, by the nature of their design, possess a rich, somewhat warmer tone than the often bright clarity of condensers. The vocals from many classic recordings were captured on ribbon mics. Just ask Old Blue Eyes. And modern versions of these are still popular. But the traditional side-address large diaphragm condenser is, by far, the most common choice for vocal recording. Thanks to the many classic, top-of-the-line models that have been employed over the years on countless records, they're generally thought of as a very high-end, high-ticket item, with many modern high-end models coming in at around $3 or $4 grand, and with real classic vintage units often going for many times those prices when they're available. One of the biggest selling points for a very high-end studio is often its mic closet, chock full of these vintage gems, easily inducing gear envy in even the most practical studio types. The classic brands, like Neumann, arguably the king of studio vocal mics, plus AKG and many others, have come to be synonymous with the best vocal recordings, so it's no wonder that, when a small studio operator or solo recordist gets around to selecting his or her primary vocal mic, these brands and models are where his attention is naturally drawn, despite the relatively high cost of entry to that club. But nowadays, there are actually many, many excellent vocal condensers available, and a lot of them can be had at much more reasonable prices that would have been unheard of years ago for mics of their quality. Now, of course, people are drawn to the most famous and respected brands and models, but, especially when budget is a consideration, just how high-end does your vocal condenser mic really have to be to deliver the goods in the modern age? Over the years, certain mic models have come to be seen as the holy grails of studio recording. The Neumann U47, a vintage tube mic first introduced in 1949, may be the ultimate object of desire for many recordists. It's renowned far and wide for its combination of warmth and detail, and since it's no longer in production, you could expect to have to shell out many thousands of dollars for an actual vintage unit, and only slightly less for one of the high-end clones currently in production. Other Neumann models like the vintage U47 FET, M49, and U67, and similarly revered models from AKG like the C12 or 414, along with many others, are the iconic images that spring to everyone's mind when they envision a studio recording session. But if there is a vocal condenser that's as ubiquitous in the studio as the SM58 is on stage, it's got to be the Neumann U87, a classic large diaphragm condenser that's still in production and the go-to vocal mic for far too many sessions to count. Hitting the wallet at well over $3 grand, this mic will unquestionably deliver, but that doesn't mean it's the only game in town, or that your budding studio business won't get the respect it deserves if you can't proudly display one of these when prospective clients come to call. On a small studio budget, $3 grand can be a lot to lay down for one item. Now, the conventional wisdom does suggest that even the smallest recording endeavors invest in at least one really good vocal mic, and I'd second that advice, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be one of the classic models at classic prices. There are very, very good vocal condensers available these days for a third or a quarter of the price of an 87, and decent ones for even less. That's not to say that you'd ever regret picking up a U87 or an equivalent boutique mic from your preferred mic maker. But remember, no matter how great your number one mic is, it just may not be the best choice for every vocalist out there, and having options is always a good idea. By way of example, I've tended to use my older U87 on almost every vocal recording, and a lot of other stuff as well. But there have been times when its crisp detail proved just a bit much for a singer with a peaky voice that apparently hit the 87 right in its presence peak. Remember, all the great mics have those. It's part of their mystique. I remember on one session, I ended up capturing such a singer with a decent workaday condenser in the $300 price range. That mic certainly didn't possess the 87's air and detail, but it simply tamed this vocalist's edgy voice in a way I just couldn't seem to get from the bigger, better Neumann. At least not without what would have probably been quite a bit more tweaking later on in the mix. A lot of reasonably priced vocal condenser mics nowadays do an excellent job, and if you tend to work with a wide range of performers, it might be worth considering dividing your mic budget just enough to have at least one good, even if far less pricey, alternative, maybe with a distinctly different balance for those vocals that just seem to go with your main mic like oil and water. For smaller commercial studio ventures, many of these even retain a fairly classic look to satisfy clients who really like to be at one of those big-ticket studios with their mic closets like kids in a candy store. I won't try to enumerate specific models, there's just too many, but I will lay out the general ranges where you'll find good vocal condensers and what you can expect. Around the $3,000 price point and up, sometimes way up, is where you'll find the current top-of-the-line vocal condensers, like the Neumann U87 and others. Most of these are large diaphragm multi-pattern models, offering the greatest flexibility, at least for studios with larger recording spaces. A little lower down, at around half that, maybe in the $1,500 ballpark more or less, you can often find models with that same level of detail and air, but with only a single, usually cardioid pattern. For vocals, that response pattern is what you'd probably use anyway around 90% of the time, especially in smaller recording spaces or booths, so you can still enjoy that top-of-the-line sound and maybe free up a little dough for an extra mic or two for some welcome flexibility. At around $700 or $800, up to $1,000, you'll find designs that come within a hair of the sound quality of the top models. I'd call this kind of the entry level for a true high-end vocal mic these days. Below that point, ranging from about $300 or $400 to $600 or $700, you'll find many very good condensers that would make for excellent workaday vocal mics in small budget rooms, and good second and third vocal mics, allowing for a bit of a mic closet, even when the budget can only really handle one top-of-the-line mic. In isolation, these may not have quite the depth and air of the pricier units, but you'll be hard-pressed to find anything to complain about, especially with vocals in a mix. Even the absolutely cheapest category, $100 vocal condensers, can, often surprisingly, offer up vocal mics with very good sounding, very usable quality. A number of years ago, these subcompacts were known for a noticeable sheen and slight harshness in the high end, thanks to cost-cutting in production. However, these days, the makers of these budget condensers seem to have gotten that under better control, and despite a little lingering harshness on bright percussive sounds and a lack of depth in comparison with pricier vocal condensers, they're more than just serviceable. For people on a really tight budget, they're the alternative to just going with a similarly priced SM58 dynamic. At least you get a little of that condenser sound, and if chosen carefully, they can, as I said earlier, provide better results than you'd have a right to expect. So, for a somewhat reasonable outlay, you can get an excellent vocal condenser that'll probably deliver around 90% of that elusive air and detail of the absolute best mics out there. Is that final 10% or so of depth and quality worth the exponentially greater cost? Well, that little bit of mic snob in me would say yes, if you can easily afford it without compromising other aspects of your recording rig too much to get there. But back in the real world, where I actually live most of the time, it can often be a better idea to build up a little bit of a mic closet and have some decent options than to put all your eggs in one basket, even if it is a really sweet basket. Next up, I'll move on to some issues and mistakes often made when actually recording vocal parts.